We may have a couple growers coming in a little bit late, it sounds like, but just to keep on track, I think we'll get started. So appreciate those that can make it here today in attendance. It's awesome. We know Mother Nature can't control things that happen here. So I wanted to just give a little brief highlight. Probably going to butcher names, but Matt Kamphoefner is going to start us out with Farmobile, kind of give some perspective on their business, some of the things we're doing in partnership with them, followed by Andrew talking about Lambert, about our trial data, what we learned this year through YieldQuest. Myself, we're going to kind of get into some of the cost analysis, and follow Gary Wagner and let him introduce himself this year. Kind of focusing on data, quality data, just related on this digital revolution we're all part of it. I think with that, appreciate you guys coming. Feel free to ask questions. Pretty open forum today. I mean, you guys aren't shy, and hopefully you learn something. So.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks for having Farmobile up here. It's a windy Minnesota from Kansas City. It's been great to get to know these folks over the last couple of months. I know some of you all have used our technology. So I'm going to walk us through a bit about who we are, so the folks who are learning about Farmobile, what we do, how we do it, why we do it. And then, if there's time, I have a couple slides that are a little bit of a deeper dive into our software and into our technology. Feel free to make this open, interactive, ask questions, engage in any way. We can also look at the software offline if you guys have an interest in seeing more a demo style type involvement. So just a bit about myself. I grew up on a farm in rural Missouri. Those are my soybeans up there. From 2 seasons ago, taken about August 1, that's in Charles County, Missouri, river bottom ground, so quite a bit different than some of the stuff up here, obviously, but good growing there nonetheless. I spent my entire career in agriculture, beginning first in crop insurance and then moving into the sort of technology side for about the last 6-7 years. I spent 3 years at Climate Corporation, one of those before the acquisition, 2 of those after the acquisition. Most of that emphasis around insurance and some of the stuff that they were doing there. Jumped over to Farmobile 3.5 years ago. We were an early stage company at that point in time. We had about 12 employees. Today we're up to about 70. We're on the 4th iteration of our device, so we've really invested heavily in development of the technology, trying to get the technology right before we ran too fast and loose through the countryside. Now we're at the point where we're really focused on scale, we're really focused on distribution, we're really focused on partnership with folks like Central Soda and some of the other Winfield owners throughout the Corn Belt region. So with that, I'll jump in. As we go through this, I want you to think about a couple questions. Specifically as it relates to Farmobile, I want you to think about how we do what we do. I think that's very relevant here in the era of digital agriculture. We're certainly not the only option out there in terms of collecting data. There's some other really good tools out there. Those other tools might be right for you, but I want you to think about how we're doing and how our technology is possibly different. Our strategies are different than some of the other providers that exist out there. I want you to think about why we do it. What I mean by that is, what's the goal of the company? What's the goal of that technology provider, and what does that mean for your operation? We're obviously all in this game to make money. You all have to make money at the farm gate. Central Soda has to stay in business. We have to make money at Farmobile, Deere, Climate. All these folks have to make money. But I want you to think about personally what that means to your operation relative to some of these other organizations. And then you have to answer the question is, does this matter to me? Does the way that Farmobile operates, does the way they go about their business, does that matter to me on my operation? And then I think it also matters to Central Soda to ask that same question, to say, hey, I'm out here with folks boots on the ground, with a bunch of data wrangling, trying to learn from this data, trying to take data and make it actually an ROI vehicle on my operation. And so the partnerships that are created, does that ultimately matter to your co-op? I think it does. That's part of the reason I'm here today. But I just want you all to think about that a bit. So my favorite thing other than farming is baseball. And so we're really in a new era in my opinion, here in digital agriculture and what that means. And I think we can all learn something about where we're at today as an industry based on what's transpired in baseball in the last 15 or 20 years. If you look at some of those bullet points up there, they've been keeping stats on baseball for 150 years. So the idea of some sort of numbers and maybe even number analysis around baseball is not a new concept. 50 years ago, somebody wrote a book called Percentage Baseball, and he was literally laughed out of the room. People thought he was crazy. The viewpoints at that time and really up through the 2000s, it was always like the numbers mean something, but really as a scout, as a manager, as a baseball organization, I have a much better feel for who can play and who can't based on what I can see with my eyes, based on what I can perceive, seeing and drawing on the knowledge and the experience. I think that sounds a lot like agriculture. My dad's been working the same ground for almost 50 years. He knows a lot about that ground. There's a lot of non-transferable knowledge and information that are in his head. I still think he can learn some stuff from his data. So we kind of fast forward through all this, and we get to the Oakland A's. I don't know if anybody read the book or saw the movie Moneyball, but Billy Beane and the A's, in effect, published their sort of secret to success and how they were able to win over 100 games, compete with some of the big boys in the industry by spending a third of the amount of money on player salaries. And one of the things that they were doing was deep dives into the data and really trying to make certain decisions that were more quantifiable and really trying to determine what are the key indicators of wins. Have we been looking at the wrong things all these years? And the interesting thing about that is, at least from my perspective, in the early 2000s, there was this divide between the old school scout, the individual that said, I have to be in the dirt, I have to hear it, I have to see it, I have to smell it, and that's all I'm going to believe. And the new era, sort of Ivy League, they call them Ivy League bean counters, but we hire these smart folks. I'm talking about organizations hiring smart folks with advanced degrees to start combing through piles of numbers and seeing what we can learn from that. And there was a camp out there that said, hey, we don't need these old guys anymore. What we need is just analytics, and we can drive everything from there. And that's really, I think, in baseball, where we're at 15 or 20 years ago. So I'm going to come back to that at the end, but I think that's really relevant to where we are today. So who is Farmobile? So nothing about data collection from my perspective is easy, but we've tried to make it as passive as possible in terms of being able to onboard and implement a digital strategy on your in your operation that scales, that's mixed fleet compatible, that works on various different types of equipment. And I throw this slide up here only to highlight the amount of investment that's happening in digital agriculture. A few of these numbers are a little bit dated from when these organizations sort of jumped into the deep end, but I still think it's highly relevant to remember what the bigs are doing within digital agriculture, the commitment that they have to digital agriculture, and really to, a huge part of what they're doing is digitizing your operation. And I think just by virtue of you guys being here today and your partnership with Central Soda and being part of the Yield Plus program highlights the fact that you guys are also taking ownership of that aspect of your organization. And I think that puts you pretty. I talk to a lot of folks around the country, around the Corn Belt, most of them through co-op organizations like this. And I think that puts you really fairly advanced in terms of what we see out there. There's a lot of folks that are far behind what we're seeing here. So what do? Well, it starts with the puck. We have a small piece of hardware rides in the cab, so you got some experience with that this fall. Plugs into the 9-pin diagnostic board generally. We have some modular-based harnessing to be able to get into other systems, aftermarket systems, what have you. But it's a small, universal collection device. It has a cellular plan that we manage. It has a GPS chip, so if anybody, probably doubtful, but if anybody in here is running a combine that doesn't have a native GPS monitor, if there's a mass flow sensor, if there's a moisture sensor lacking a a GPS radio in that machine, we can still map those fields because we're a full stack technology. We're managing the cellular plan, so there's no pairing, there's no ask from the operator to be able to fulfill any sort of requirements to free that data from the cab. And what we're doing is we're taking the engine information, we're taking the agronomic information, and on a 1 second increment, we're streaming that sensor data to the cloud. So when I talk about our technology and just our strategic approach is doing something different than many of the other folks, we're not trying to create a file, a processed file on an in-cab computer, your terminal, right, and move that sometimes large file over the air. There's a lot of risk in that, just because that's a really hard problem to try to solve, especially over rural cellular connections. What we're doing is we're taking that sensor data every single second and we're sending it to the cloud. If you lose connectivity, we're going to buffer those messages locally on the puck itself. We'll store a whole season of information on there. But then when connectivity is restored, cellular connectivity, we're going to send that up to the cloud. So I think the strategy in terms of how we're getting that data out of the cab is different than many of the other folks. Then I also think our modular-based harnessing system allows us to get into many more OEM and after-factory monitors and displays than most of the folks. So we can run on tractors, combines, sprayers, spreaders, some choppers. It's a wide array of equipment that we're able to get into. Then really the second leg of the stool is over there on the right side, and that's our software, that's our API, and that's really our business model. So our go-to-market approach is not to go directly to the farm gate. I'm grateful to be speaking in front of a group of farmers today. But our go-to-market is really to partner with organizations like Central Soda and help to create an efficient grower connectivity and exchange of data so that you all can be more efficient, more scalable in terms of touching more customers and getting more data, sharing more data in that local community than would otherwise be possible. We list a number of different verticals up there. We have some distribution through an insurance vertical, some distribution through equipment dealers, but the vast majority of everything that we do is through ag retail and environment. The third part of our school, and something that I think has a ton of potential, is the most immature part of the Farmobile offering, but it's the notion of the data store. It's the idea that if we can collect a standardized set of data, if we can steward that data throughout the season, if we can layer in some cases several machine passes, planting, fertility, crop protection, harvest, if we can layer data geospatially well. Some buyers are asking for data through time, so they want to know what the field did, for example, for the last 2 or 3 seasons. But if we can curate a really good data set, we can put the farmer in a position to be able to monetize that data set. Really important things to learn here is that you're always in control of that transaction. So if you have data that's in the data store and there's a bid that comes in, so somebody comes in and wants to buy it, this is a marketplace, you're going to know who's offering on the data, what that offer amount is for, what data they're seeking to acquire, and at that point you're saying yes or no to that transaction. The beauty of these transactions is that's not a physical commodity that we sell once and it's down the road. This is something that some folks are having the opportunity to sell that same layer of data or that same data package multiple times. And so I think that's where it gets exciting, is being able to take that same data layer, share it with your agronomy team, share it with your insurance man, and then also be able to directly monetize that information. So I don't know if there's any questions around that. That's a largely new concept. We can talk about it offline too if anything strikes you.
Who would buy something?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I didn't call out specifically, but we know the marketing community, in terms of the trading community, is always looking for an informational advantage that they can make decisions off of. We've had a number of folks in that space approach us. Where we're sitting at today is they're looking for big densities of data and just a vast amount. We have not been able to fulfill their request to date, just because of the amount of information that they're looking for. get a little bit gun-shy when we think about markets and market information and how that influences. My perspective is that better information actually leads to more stable markets over time, which leads to more predictability at the farm gate, which is a good thing for all of us. The beauty of market information is that once it gets out there and somebody is buying that information, people aren't going to want to give up a informational advantage to a competitor. So then there's going to be multiple folks that are seeking that information. We've had sort of the same thing in the reinsurance community. There are, you all probably know this, but there are 15 companies, insurance companies, which hold all of the risk on your crop insurance policies, on your hail policies. Much of that risk is passed off into the reinsurance market. The global reinsurance market doesn't have a lot of visibility into what's actually happening at the field level, so they're a potential suitor for this data. We have the manufacturers, so the people that are producing the seeds, crop protection, for example, fungicide, people talking about product performance and how things are working in the countryside. The folks that we've seen coming from that angle so far are not the biggest of the manufacturing companies, but then you get to more of a middle tier that do not have the same boots on the ground presence as some of the bigs to be able to collect that data. And so they're trying to figure out how they can get better information around their product use and their product performance. We've sold to universities. The interesting thing about this is that most of the buyers, we do it under NDA, they ask not to be disclosed. They see the information that they're getting as a benefit to them, as an advantage, and so they don't want to be identified in that capacity. Mississippi State University is the exception to that. They bought data for research purposes. They didn't buy it in Mississippi. They wanted data from Iowa.